Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm headed back to Answers in Genesis Canada to see part 2 of the video that they forgot to let us know was part of a series last time. You know, the one where I went all unhinged with the knife and the skin mask and the skulls and whatnot. In that one, they said they were debunking all the best evidence for evolution in 12 minutes. But then as it turned out, they were actually starting to go through some of the evidence for evolution in chronological order, starting with stuff from the 1800s. And it wound up being part of a series, so either AIG has some pretty massive communication issues going on, where the people that are writing the titles don't seem to have access to anything else to do with the video, including the video itself, or they're perfectly comfortable lying for clicks. This video shows every indication of continuing this trend, as it is titled, "This video destroys all of the latest proof of evolution." If I were to guess from the title, this would get into, the latest scientific advances in evolution. Things like the recent advances in the study of endosymbiosis, where researchers have discovered the first example of a nitrogen-fixing organelle in marine algae, which is only the fourth known example of endosymbiosis, the process by which one organism will incorporate another organism into itself as part of its life cycle. I mean, that one is from earlier this year, so maybe it's too recent and AIG just missed it, but surely we'll get into something from this millennium, right? Well, I haven't watched ahead yet, but I did see the headings while I was removing their music, and it doesn't look promising. Seems like they're lying for clicks again, which is a strange behavior from an organization that is so insistent that lying is always wrong in every scenario that they actually have an article on their website right now explaining why it would be wrong to lie to a Nazi in order to save a Jew. Anyway, let's get into it. But first, I'm excited to announce that I've joined the Creator Accountability Network, or CAN. CAN is a nonprofit dedicated to reducing harassment and abuse through ethical education and a system of restorative accountability. I joined because I care about the safety and well-being of my community members. If you feel that my behavior or content has harmed someone, please report it to CAN either via the reporting form on their website, creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org, or via their hotline at 617-249-4255. They'll help me make it right and avoid repeating that mistake in the future. CAN also needs volunteers from our communities to help with their work, so if you have skills you think would be helpful, or the time and desire to help, please visit their website to find out how you can volunteer. Most importantly, get the word out to other creators who you think would be interested in getting credentialed. Help us build safer communities together.
Now, let's jump through time here a bit and get some more modern supposed examples of proofs of evolution. Because sometimes critics think, well, that was way back when, Darwinian evolution was in its infancy, and scientists obviously found way better proofs as time went along.
I mean, yeah, that is a true statement, but considering how much you had to leave out of the story last time in order to make your case, not to mention the outright lies, it seems to me as though you can't even counter the evidence for evolution that Darwin had access to, much less the plethora of evidence that has been discovered in the 165 years since Origin of Species was published.
Well, here's an example for naturalism that's persisted since 1952.
Yep, there we go. The title was just a lie for clicks. Unless you think that something from 1952 could reasonably be called the latest of anything? I mean, I guess you could call something from 1952 the latest if you get specific enough. The latest Bentley Mark VI, for instance, is the 1952 version, because that's when they stopped making that car. But we're talking about the category of evidence for evolution here. That would be like saying that you're going to be talking about the latest in automotive technology, and then starting out by talking about the 52 Bentley. So either Answers in Genesis is just massively incomprehensibly incompetent, or they're willing to compromise their morals for the sake of clicks. We all know which option it is, but either way, they aren't doing much to help build confidence in their quality as a source for anything.
And from the grandson of Charles Darwin's bulldog, T.H. Huxley, Julian Huxley, who published an article titled Evolution's Copycats. His goal was to use an easily understood example of natural selection in action to explain its undoubted ability to cause creatures to adapt.
Yes, not just natural selection, but also the development of mimicry, where one organism evolves to resemble a different organism. And he did a decent job of it. He used the crab that has been nicknamed the samurai crab as a jumping-off point, explaining how superstitious fishermen hundreds of years ago would throw crabs back that looked vaguely like they had human faces on their carapace, while keeping the ones that did not, thus providing a selection pressure that pushed the crabs into looking more like people than they otherwise would. From there, he talked about things like leaf insects, ant spiders, and thorn bugs, pointing out that even a very distant resemblance might provide a survival advantage, with the subsequent generations looking more and more like whatever it is that allowed them to survive in the first place. Side note, I know we all love to complain about how many ads we see nowadays, and rightly so, but being bombarded with an intrusive number of ads is not a new phenomenon. This article was actually quite difficult to read because on most pages it took up only about 25% of the page, with the other 75% being dedicated to ads for things like Sexton's combination dish and lingerie detergent. I mean, my life is just too busy to have a different soap for my dishes and my lingerie, so that increase in efficiency will give me enough extra time that I'll be able to sift through all those ads. Thanks, Sextons!
Then he would extrapolate that idea to try and persuade his audience that all of life's incredible design could be explained naturalistically.
I mean, life isn't designed, but yes, it can be explained naturalistically. That wasn't actually the point of the article, though. It was just explaining one single aspect of how evolution worked. I'm skipping a bit now. When we come back, What's-His-Nuts will have just finished explaining the samurai crab thing that I just explained, so no need to hear it twice.
And eventually, this argument became quite popular when it was used by famous evolutionist Carl Sagan on his Cosmos TV series in the 1970s.
Yes, and Sagan used it as a jumping-off point to explain artificial selection. I don't know why you keep calling this an argument when it's not. It's just an example. If I show you this 3D printed cat and tell you that this is a thing you can do with a 3D printer, and then go on to talk about other things you can do with a 3D printer, my showing you the cat is not an argument for 3D printing, it's just an example of a thing that was 3D printed.
Well, unfortunately for evolutionists, besides the fact that these samurai face shapes occur in nearly all members of this crab family, whether they live near Japan or not, and that there are examples of fossil Doripid-type crabs which predate the samurai warrior caste by thousands of years by their own evolutionary timeline, i.e. there were samurai crabs before there were samurai, the story really doesn't make much sense at all when the truth came out.
Okay, so the example was a bad example. I'd argue that it's still useful, as a story about artificially selecting something with a human face on it might resonate with people in a way that will make the overall point easier to understand, because humans are rather self-centered species after all. But remember, this is an educational example that was used to help people understand an aspect of evolution. In Huxley's case, mimicry. Mimicry is still a thing that happens, even if it turns out that the samurai crab is not actually an example of mimicry, but is instead just pareidolia. Like, if instead of this vampire cat, I showed you the Saturn V model behind me and told you that that was an example of 3D printing, that would be incorrect. It's made of Lego, which I believe is injection molded. But that doesn't mean that all the other 3D printed things on my shelf behind me don't exist. Hell, it doesn't even mean that you couldn't make that exact Saturn V Lego set using 3D printing. I happen to have a SCAD file that will allow me to create any Lego brick I want with my 3D printer. So I could make any Lego set you care to imagine entirely out of 3D printed bricks. So while that specific example of a Saturn V is not 3D printed, it is plausible that such a model could be made using 3D printing. Same with the samurai crabs. They didn't actually come about through the actions of superstitious fishermen, but that is a plausible mechanism by which such a feature could develop.
And the absolute kill shot for this supposed evolutionary proof comes from evolution-believing marine biologist and crustacean expert Joel Martin, former associate curator of invertebrate zoology at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. He showed the absolute absurdity of the entire story when he revealed, the fishermen who make their living from the Sea of Japan do not eat any of these crabs. Whether they resemble a samurai, a human face, or merely a crab is a moot point. All are thrown back.
Whoever wrote this section of the video was just being lazy. They've essentially just parroted the Wikipedia article for these crabs, but they're doing it in a way that makes it look like they've compiled information from different sources. But no. All of the points mentioned that counter the crab story come from Joel Martin's article in Terra called The Samurai Crab, including the ones that they brought up before mentioning Dr. Martin, and he is source number 5 in the Wikipedia article. Also, while it may be true that nobody eats these crabs today, they are edible. They just aren't thought to be worth it because of how small they are. But it wouldn't surprise me if they were a food source that has been turned to occasionally when times get desperate, so to say that nobody eats them today because they are so small, therefore nobody ever ate them, seems like it assumes too much. But sure, there are fossils of closely related crabs that have similar face-looking shapes on them, so no, the face shape is not the result of fishermen throwing them back.
So, in addition to the other facts of the matter, if the entire story was based on fishermen selecting these crabs, the samurai crab is obviously not proof of evolution.
No, it wasn't proof of evolution. It was an example of one of the mechanisms of evolution. A bad example, given that it didn't evolve in the way that would work with the story, but just as pointing out that my Saturn V is not 3D printed does not mean that all of the other 3D printed things on my shelf don't exist, the samurai crab not being the result of artificial selection does not mean that mimicry can't happen through evolution, or that artificial selection doesn't work. I mean, for fuck's sake, literally everything you eat has been artificially selected to favor traits that we humans value in our food, so pick any of the foods that you ate today, and that could replace the crab as an example of artificial selection.
Now, a year later in 1953, you may have thought you'd hit the evolutionary evidential jackpot when you started seeing a diagram in textbooks showing some glass containers containing gases, electrodes, and a small organic trap at the bottom.
Yeah, it's the Miller-Urey experiment, which demonstrated that amino acids can form in a plausible natural setting. Now, it is obsolete at this point because we have learned that its simulated atmosphere was not likely to have been the actual atmosphere of the early Earth, but it was a groundbreaking experiment that inspired many other experiments which have successfully demonstrated the formation of amino acids using simulated atmospheres that are more likely to have actually been similar to the early Earth. Hell, since the title of this video explicitly states that it's about the latest proof of evolution, not experiments from 70 years ago, why not go with the paper published in 2023 that talks about how asteroid impacts provided iron necessary to result in the reducing atmosphere that would form nitriles through photochemical mechanisms. That's pretty much in the direct line of succession from the Miller-Urey experiment, so much so that the way I found out about it was by reading the Wikipedia page for the Miller-Urey experiment. You know, that extremely lazy form of research that the AIG interns have already demonstrated that they can do? Yeah, I'm gonna bet that they didn't even bother with that kind of lazy research for this part. And of course, obligatory mention that this is prebiotic chemistry, not evolution. Those are two different things.
Based on a recent experiment, this promoted the idea that scientists had basically found a way to make life in a test tube.
No, absolutely not. They were after amino acids, and they got amino acids. At no point did anyone expect life to show up in their test tube.
Simply because they'd synthesized a mixture of amino acids, the supposed building blocks of all life, in a laboratory.
Wait, why are you calling amino acids the supposed building blocks of life? Are you an amino acid denier? Regardless of how life got to where it is today, the proteins that make up life are still made out of amino acids, so yeah, building block might be an oversimplification, but you're still literally mostly made out of amino acids. And creationists wonder why people call them anti-science. Y'all are so used to casting doubt on every scientific thing you talk about that even when you're talking about something that creationists typically accept, you're still likely to accidentally describe it with words like supposed. And yes, I assume that was accidental because I assume that Calvin wouldn't actually deny that he is physically made of the stuff that he's physically made of. Just whoever wrote that script didn't know what amino acids were and didn't feel like taking a few seconds to find out, so threw supposed in there as a hedge, and Calvin just reads what's on the prompter, no ad-libs. But at the end of the day, no matter how that got in there, in order to believe Calvin, you have to be trusting an organization that doesn't feel the need to figure out if amino acids are a real thing in biology before casting doubt on them. Do you really trust that they've done the legwork necessary to disprove the basis for our understanding of modern biology if they can't be arsed to learn what a fucking amino acid is?
All with the takeaway message science had shown that life can happen through purely natural processes.
And all the origin of life research since then has supported that idea. And it's quite telling that you have to go all the way back to the 1950s to find a version of the experiment to laugh at. Why do creationists insist on ignoring the 7 decades of research that has happened since then? No doubt he's about to explain that its findings are invalid because they got the composition of the early Earth atmosphere wrong, but I wonder why that even matters when we've discovered amino acids free-floating in space and on meteors. Whether their experiment was right or wrong, it is now undeniably obvious that amino acids can form naturally, and showing that was the entire goal of the experiment. So stop bothering with Miller-Urey and start addressing the actual amino acids that we found that actually formed naturally.
Highly lauded for years as powerful proof in support of an evolutionary worldview, today we hear modern comments like the following from a Time magazine article. This textbook picture of how life originated, so familiar to college students just a generation ago, is under serious attack.
Okay, I know I keep getting distracted by behind-the-scenes stuff, but this is a recurring theme with Answers in Genesis. In this case, they've got the citation for that article being an article in Time magazine from June 24th, 2001, by J. Madeline Nash, called How Did Life Begin? Well, when I go to the URL that they have displayed, nothing comes up. Okay, fine, websites update their shit all the time, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, so I go to search their archives and find that there wasn't even a June 24th issue of Time magazine in 2001. Closest one is June 25th. And when I check the table of contents for the June 25th issue, this article is nowhere to be found. So I did the unthinkable and turned to Google. After scrolling past the Gemini answer telling me that it's still a mystery with many theories and no agreed upon answer, the featured snippet saying it came from the seafloor magma, and 5 sponsored results. Do you guys remember back when Google was actually good? Anyway, I finally found it in the October 11th issue from 1993. I don't know what processes they have going on the back end that allow for these kinds of mistakes to slip in, but this isn't the first time I've gone off on a tangent because they weren't paying attention to their own shit. Remember that other time when they were looking for videos to list of Christians who had left their faith, and in order to pad their list they included things like a sermon from Life.Church called Leaving Christianity, and a woman who told the story of that time she had some doubts but got through them and remained a Christian? It's debatable whether these are even details that are worth bringing up, but I think it is. This seems to be a pattern that reveals how little AIG thinks of their audience. These aren't difficult details to get right, so the fact that they don't even bother suggests that they expect their audience to not check their sources. As long as there's something there showing that they're using a source, that'll be good enough. No need to spend any time making sure the article we're citing was written in the same decade as the citation says it was. Now, I don't expect that everyone who watches my videos will check up on all my sources. I know how these things work. The vast majority of you won't check on a single one of my sources. But I'm not banking on that fact in order to slip things past you. All of the shit that shows up while I'm talking is accurate, and I have procedures in place to make sure they are accurate. So while I expect that most people will never click the links or look for my sources, I still make sure that they're there for the ones that do, because I respect my audience. Anyway, the article is mostly talking about the shifting picture of the early Earth, how it moved away from the atmospheric composition that was used for the Miller-Urey experiment, and the development of other origin of life models, particularly the RNA world hypothesis, which would have RNA coming before amino acids and proteins. So it's not under attack in the sense that the experiment didn't yield useful results. It's under attack in the sense that we've learned more stuff since then and need to adjust our models and experiments to accommodate the new information.
The article, written from a pro-evolution standpoint, goes on to describe the many reasons this experiment fails to live up to its initial claims and admits that the origin of life is still a mystery.
And 31 years later, it's still a mystery. Albeit less of one than it was when the 1993 article was written, and in 1993, it was less of a mystery than it was in 1953. You see how that works? That's called scientific progress. We learn new shit all the time. That's how it's supposed to be. And this whole video series seems to be Calvin seeing our knowledge progress, only to complain that we didn't know everything perfectly right from the get-go, so it must be false. Sorry, Calvin, but that just isn't how it works.
So, unlike what many thought, this experiment comes nowhere near being proof of chemical evolution.
Well, chemical evolution in the scientific sense could mean a number of different things. Everything from stellar nucleosynthesis to molecular evolution to evolution of metal ions in biological systems, and yes, even to abiogenesis. But you appear to be doing the Kent Hovind thing, where you try to fit all the science you don't like under the umbrella term evolution in order to make it look like you're less science-denying than you actually are. Strictly speaking, it does apply in this case, but the way Calvin is using the term seems to be designed to confuse the matter rather than bring clarity.
Okay, well let's move on to 1959, when a certain Dr. Kettlewell published an article in Scientific American summarizing his studies of the textbook story of England's famous peppered moths that became what some evolutionists considered the prize horse in the stable of evolutionary proofs for years thereafter.
Again, though, peppered moths were never proof of evolution. They are merely an example of natural selection in action. If you somehow manage to disprove the peppered moth story, all that means is that there was something going on with them specifically that we did not fully understand. It says nothing about evolution as a whole.
The story went like this. The particular moths normally come in light and dark forms. But when the pollution from the Industrial Revolution darkened the tree trunks, the lighter colored moths, which had been previously well camouflaged, now stood out against the dark background, making them more vulnerable to predation by birds.
That is one of several hypotheses, yes. And notably, while Kettlewell is most well known for advancing that hypothesis, it has been discussed in the literature as far back as the 1890s, so you're actually going backwards in time at this point.
The result? Well, the proportion of dark moths increased over the light ones, and later on, when the pollution was cleaned up, the light moths became more dominant again. Survival of the fittest. Voila! Evolution has been observed.
Yes, evolution has been observed. In the 1800s, there was a sharp change in the frequency of melanic moths, the ones with darker coloration. They went from being a rare variant to the dominant variant in a very short time period. And then in the 1950s to 70s, the dominance flipped again. And since evolution is, at its most basic, descent with modification, this is definitionally an example of evolution.
And this professed example of evolution in action has been taught to countless students as positive proof for the story of evolution.
No, again, it is not taught as proof. It is an example, like you just said. Examples are not proof.
But some rather recent and damning truths have come out surrounding his experiments, including the fact that Kettlewell glued moths to trees instead of deriving conclusions based on what he was observing naturally.
I'm not sure why that matters. The fact that the frequency of the allele that causes melanism in these moths significantly changed both in the late 1800s and in the 1950s to 70s is not in dispute. The allele frequency changed over successive generations. Descent with modification, ergo, evolution was observed, whether Kettlewell placed them on trees himself or not. And while he did place live moths on trees when releasing them, he didn't glue them there. And the changes in these moths, the evolution if you will, is directly correlated with the rise and fall of industrial pollution, resulting in this pattern being referred to as industrial melanism. But as with anything in nature, the simplified story that we find in high school textbooks doesn't have all the details. For instance, industrial melanism didn't happen in the northern English industrial region. It was mostly constrained to South Wales and the surrounding English region. There are a plethora of factors that could impact the selection pressures that lead to melanism: atmospheric pollution, darkening of surfaces, food plant abundance, predators, etc. There is still research going into determining the causes of industrial melanism, and it almost certainly is not as simple as darker trees are easier to hide in when you're dark, but that doesn't invalidate it as an example.
Indeed. Evolutionary biologist and vocal atheist Jerry Coyne commented on the downfall of this icon of evolution. Until now, however, the prize horse in our stable of examples has been the evolution of industrial melanism in the peppered moth.
Congrats on getting your citation correct on that one, I guess. It's a low bar, but you cleared it this time. But notably, if we continue reading past that quote, Coyne continues the prize horse analogy, saying of the peppered moth example that it is in bad shape and, while not yet ready for the glue factory, needs serious attention. In other words, it's still a valid example, but there's more to the story than we normally hear.
However, regardless of the fudge results Kettlewell produced, it doesn't make a bit of difference anyway.
Right, because this is still very clearly an example of natural selection in action, even if the cause of the selection pressure isn't as clear-cut as birds could see them better.
Eminent British evolutionist zoologist L. Harrison Matthews admitted the following when writing his introduction to Darwin's 1971 edition of Origin of Species. The experiments beautifully demonstrate natural selection, or survival of the fittest, in action. But they do not show evolution in progress. For however the populations may alter in their content or light, intermediate, or dark forms, all the moths remain from beginning to end Biston Betularia.
That seems like splitting hairs. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there's more context here that makes it less damning, but I can't find that specific edition of Origin to find out, nor can I find his introduction to it in isolation. The only places that quote seems to come up are creationist sites using it the same way Calvin is using it here. But ultimately, it doesn't particularly matter. Worst case scenario here is that he's pointing out that it's an example of natural selection, which it is. I just don't see how the change in the frequency of an allele in a population over time does not also count as evolution. Nobody, to my knowledge, said that these were a different species of moth, but that doesn't make this example not count as evolution.
Indeed, moths of different colors evolving into moths of different colors isn't really that impressive at all.
No, it's not. It's just an easy-to-see example of how changes in an organism's environment can change what traits are beneficial to that organism, thus exerting a selection pressure that drives a change in the organism itself. Being easy to see and understand is probably why it shows up in textbooks for children so much. Sorry that it's too advanced for you guys, though.
And once again, an iconic proof of evolution gets tossed out.
Ain't it just the epitome of creationist thinking to read an educational book and misunderstand not just the concepts being presented, but why they are being presented to such a massive degree that it leads you to defacing that educational book and declaring it useless? Also, I seriously consider doing a similar shtick with a Bible, where I read some useless verse, which the vast majority of them are, by the way, followed by my tearing it out and throwing it in the garbage. But I have too much respect for books to do something like that. It just feels wrong. Doesn't even matter what the book is. Written language is quite possibly the single most important invention in human history, and the printing press making books more affordable for the masses is pretty high up on that list as well. I have a hard time disconnecting those ideas from the physical objects that represent them, so to me, it doesn't matter if it's a good book, a bad book, a book I agree with or disagree with, even a book that contains ideas whose dissemination is downright dangerous. I cannot bring myself to do what Calvin is doing. I mean, there's also the fact that we live in a time when we can look back through history and see that the people who advocated for the destruction of written material that they disagreed with are universally the bad guys in those stories. So like, destroying a book I disagree with probably just gets closer to imagery that I'm very uncomfortable with, like book burnings. So yeah, as much as I can get up on my high horse and pontificate about the importance of literature to humanity, my high horse is surprisingly low. It could also just be that the destroying of books makes me think of Nazis, and I'd rather not do a thing that is so closely associated with them. Okay, that's enough high horse. To be clear, I am not saying that Calvin or AIG are Nazis, but they do appear to be perfectly comfortable using imagery that makes people think of Nazis. So make of that what you will.
Okay, well, let's move up to the 1970s, where we can get into the really good stuff.
For the record, we are now about halfway through their video that is ostensibly destroying the latest proof of evolution. And now he says we're finally getting to the good stuff. But we're still in the 1970s.
Because even though the term had been around in the 1960s, evolutionists really began declaring that junk DNA strongly supported the story of evolution in 1972.
I wouldn't use the term junk DNA, but there are definitely non-coding regions of our genome that do not appear to serve any function whatsoever, except to be a buffer of sorts, so that when mutations happen, they are most likely going to happen in a region of the genome that does nothing, and so the mutation will not impact anything.
The basic idea was similar to the old vestigial organ argument, that there must have been useless leftovers in our body from our evolutionary past applied to our DNA.
In the last video, he completely missed the point of vestigial structures. He tried to say that evolution is supposed to make things better, so finding something that was useful but is now useless would be evidence against evolution. Which isn't actually how it works. It's not about getting better in some objective sense where there is a clear path toward becoming a better organism. It's better in the sense that it's slightly better at surviving and reproducing than other organisms that compete for the same resources. Sometimes this can result in evolutionary changes that we might look at and say, hey, that's getting worse. But they actually do result in an advantage for the organism. Like the loss of eyes in cavefish. These fish are descended from fish with eyes, but they live in an environment where sight provides no advantage, so the energy that it takes to develop eyes is wasted, thus providing a small selection pressure towards mutations that halt the development of their eyes. That is still evolution, despite our gut reaction that it isn't getting better, and it's also a simplified explanation that is easy to understand, but quite a bit more complicated when you get into the details. For instance, in 2003, it was discovered that lens tissue from closely related surface fish who can see could be transplanted into the blind fish embryos during development, which would then result in them developing normal eyes. This is because their eyes begin developing, but at a rather late stage of the development process, a cascade of apoptosis, programmed cell death, happens, beginning with the lens. So if you put a lens that isn't programmed to die at that time, then none of the other cells go through apoptosis either. But hang on. These eye-making tissues are already pretty well developed when they start dying off. Isn't that wasting the energy that is required to make them in the first place, thus calling the energy-saving selection pressure hypothesis into question? Yes, but when you get into it, even though the eyes do develop significantly during embryonic stages, their reabsorption does render the juvenile stage of development much less costly from an energy use standpoint, as they don't need to continue developing them, or the parts of the brain needed for the processing of visual stimuli. So while this is, once again, not a perfect example of one single factor that impacts the selection pressures on an organism, it's pretty damn close. And honestly, if you expect nature to work in such a simplistic way, you probably shouldn't be speaking as though you are anything close to a reliable authority on any scientific subject.
And because scientists didn't know what a large portion of our DNA did, they declared it was junk. Of course, they were wrong about that, much to the detriment of science.
Firstly, being wrong about something is not detrimental to science. Learning that you are wrong about something is how scientific progress is made. There's a reason one of Miss Frizzle's catchphrases in the Magic School Bus is, "Take chances, make mistakes, get messy!"
It's time to take chances, make mistakes, and get messy.
Second, we didn't decide that big chunks of our genome had no purpose simply because we didn't know what they did. That is laughably absurd. If anything, it's the other way around. We know that if evolution is true, there should be big chunks of our DNA that don't really serve much, if any, function, and the more we map out the human genome, the more we find that to be the case. Now, go ahead and tell me that the ENCODE project found that 80% or so of the genome is functional. We'll deal with that when he gets there.
Indeed, this evolutionary view impeded progress for decades because researchers considered 98% of DNA to be junk.
Well, now you're just conflating non-coding DNA with non-functional DNA. Because it is a true statement that only about 2% of our genome codes for genes. But it is well known that our genetic material does perform functions other than coding proteins, and has been for those decades that you are saying we were failing to progress scientifically because of our assumption of 98% junk DNA in our genomes. Like, seriously, in 1964, it was estimated that we had 6.7 million protein-coding genes. Even the researchers that estimated that said it was distressingly high, but they couldn't bring themselves to consider the possibility of junk DNA. So yeah, they didn't assume that DNA was useless if they couldn't figure out what it did. They assumed that it had an as-yet undiscovered purpose until they learned otherwise. Estimates for the coding fraction of our genome were consistently between 100,000 and 500,000 genes before the publication of the Human Genome Project in 2001. In the years following that publication, the estimates started coming down until now they've settled around 20,000 genes, which accounts for roughly 2% of our genome. I'm legitimately struggling with just how exactly backwards Calvin has it. He literally said that our assumption that 98% of the genome was useless impeded scientific progress for decades, when the starting assumption of evolution-accepting scientists was that most, if not all, of our genome was not useless, which we gradually learned was not the case.
So many, but luckily not all, evolutionists didn't even bother to research the non-coding supposed junk regions.
Nope. They were calling for more research to be done to figure out what the purposes are for the regions that we don't understand, not ignoring them.
However, one scientist who didn't buy into the idea of junk DNA was Professor John Maddock, a leading figure in the science of genetics, who concluded, "The failure to recognize the implications of the non-coding DNA will go down, I think, as the biggest mistake in the history of molecular biology." Now, why did he say that?
Probably because he said that as part of an interview for a documentary on a businessman who patented 95% of the human genome in the 1990s, and whose company, Genetic Technologies, was charging licensing fees to any researchers who wanted to work with any of that portion of the genome. At the time of the documentary, 2003, Genetic Technologies had begun aggressively enforcing their patent, and Maddock was advocating against their enforcement. As such, he was likely using hyperbolic language in order to stress the seriousness of the problem. Hell, if Genetic Technologies had been enforcing their patent in the 90s, the Human Genome Project might never have happened. So again, Calvin is pretty much exactly backward here. He's claiming that the label of junk DNA caused scientists to stop researching it, when it was the guy who, according to the documentary, had the foresight to know that there would be functions found in the junk DNA regions, actually stifled research through the enforcement of a ridiculous patent. Now, to be clear, at least in the United States as of 2013, naturally occurring genes can no longer be patented, but that documentary made the same mistake as Calvin, equating non-coding with has no purpose. Notably, in the entire transcript of the documentary, I can't find the video unfortunately, Maddock never used the term junk DNA. So even while advocating for a cause, making use of hyperbole to stress how important it is, he still wasn't willing to just call non-coding DNA junk.
Because, as usual, with more research, scientists have discovered, shock of shocks, that what had been designated junk isn't evolutionary junk after all.
Nobody thought that all of the non-coding DNA was junk. I mean, maybe I did. I know you can find old videos of mine where I did make that mistake as well, but sloppy language does not negate decades of scientific research.
As a recent 2021 paper published in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution stated, the days of junk DNA are over.
Yeah, that's likely the only sentence in that entire paper that Calvin, or more likely the intern in charge of putting together the research for this video, was able to understand. It is quite technical, and I'm not going to even pretend to understand more than a tiny amount of it myself. It seems to be looking at non-coding W elements found in a specific parasite species. If I'm reading it correctly, which is a massive if, they found that variation in these W elements created phenotypic variation in the parasites that would be subject to selection pressures. The days of junk DNA are over line is from the discussion section, where they talk about how the conflation of non-coding DNA with useless junk is a bad thing that should be, and in the scientific community at least has mostly been, stopped. And since that's what Calvin is doing here, this quote actually works against him.
Why? Well, the international team of 442 scientists involved in the ENCODE Encyclopedia of DNA Elements project began trying to identify all functional elements in the human genome.
And here we go. Okay, let's let him explain it a bit before I rip it to shreds.
And Discover Magazine's website reported, ENCODE has shown that the rest of the genome, the non-coding majority, is still rife with functional elements. That is, it's doing something. According to ENCODE's analysis, 80% of the genome has a biochemical function. The key point is, it's not junk.
Yep, that was their conclusion. The eagle-eyed and/or bat-eared among you might have noticed that 80% is significantly less than 100%. Meaning that even if we accept the ENCODE project's results at face value, 20% of the genome is still useless junk. Weird thing to happen if the entire genome is intelligently designed. But notably, the one time ENCODE tried to calculate the functional fraction of the genome is the only time any team of researchers trying to do that has come up with that high a number. The majority of them wind up with a functional fraction of 10 to 15%. Why is that? Simply put, it's because they use the wrong definition of the word functional. In biology, there are two main definitions of the word function. One is that the selected effect function of a trait is the effect for which the trait was selected and by which it is maintained. That is, it's an answer to the question, why does this trait exist and what caused it to evolve? The other, the causal role definition, is ad hoc. What does the trait do? Whatever it does, that must be its function. To highlight the difference, look at the heart. The selected effect function of the heart is to pump blood. But if we switch to the causal role definition, we can look at literally anything the heart does and declare that to be its function. For instance, it produces a thumping sound that is useful for medical diagnostics. Now, this doesn't mean that the causal role definition should never be used. Quite the contrary, all selected effect functions will still count as functions using the causal role definition, and when studying evolution, the actual selected effect function of a trait might not be immediately apparent, so hypotheses about the function of that trait will necessarily use the causal role definition until we learn more about it. But because of the ad hoc nature of the causal role definition, traits can be said to have functions that are in no way tied to their biology or evolutionary history. To steal the example from a paper that is directly responding to the ENCODE project, the heart has the function of providing inspiration for love songs and greeting cards. That is a causal role function. It's a thing that the heart does, but it is completely unrelated to anything biological, and certainly the heart did not evolve in order to fulfill the function of littering the world with cheesy greeting cards. So what does this have to do with ENCODE? Easy. They use the ad hoc causal role definition of function, where if they could find that a nucleotide in our genome did literally anything, it counted as functional, no matter how irrelevant to function that thing is. Taken to its extreme, all the nucleotides in the human genome will at some point be replicated. Since every nucleotide is replicated, every nucleotide does a thing. Ergo, the entire genome is functional. Do you see how ridiculous that would be? And that's just the problem with the definition. To again steal from the paper that responded directly to them, one of many I might add, quote, "This absurd conclusion was reached through various means, chiefly by employing the seldom used causal role definition of biological function, and then applying it inconsistently to different biochemical properties, by committing a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent, by failing to appreciate the crucial difference between junk DNA and garbage DNA, by using analytical methods that yield biased errors and inflate estimates of functionality, by favoring statistical sensitivity over specificity, and by emphasizing statistical significance rather than the magnitude of the effect."
And even that number was too low.
Ah yes, here comes the hedging about the fact that even using their egregiously flawed methods and definitions, they could only get the functional fraction of the genome up to 80%. So now we come to the quotes about how, if they don't have to try and sneak their shit past peer review, they can make it look even higher.
Dr. Ewan Burney, lead analysis coordinator for ENCODE since 2007, explained that after looking at 147 of the few thousand types of cells in the human body, it's likely that 80% will go to 100%. We don't really have any large chunks of redundant DNA. This metaphor of junk isn't that useful.
Okay, so that 80% number is likely going to go to 100%. And yet all the research I've found since then has pegged it as between 10 to 15%. And I know that nothing has been published that claimed 100% function, because if it had, Calvin would have started with that, not with the 80% one followed by one guy's gut feeling that it'll be higher later. Well, it's been 12 years now. The entire ENCODE project initially only took 5 years to complete, and we have better methodology now, so why haven't they changed their tune yet if he was actually right about that prediction?
Well, let's move on to 1975, where we'll take a look at a long-enduring proof of evolution that many believe was truly convincing, and one you would have almost surely have been taught based on a scientific study done that year, and is one of the most powerful arguments for evolution. And that is, human and chimps' DNA are incredibly similar, up to 98% in fact.
Yes and no. Our DNA is about 98 to 99% identical to chimp DNA, provided we measure the similarity in a way that will essentially give us that number. We'll get into it, I'm sure, but this falls plainly into the Obi-Wan Kenobi realm. What they told you is true, from a certain point of view.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
However, it's simply not the case. As usual, as our understanding of these differences grow, we've seen several studies revealing significant differences now. There's a 13.3% difference in sections of our immune system when insertions and deletions are considered. The chimpanzee genome is 12% larger than the human genome.
Yes, and he goes on like this. The problem lies in how a difference is calculated. Normally, for a percentage difference calculation, it's a simple matter of dividing the difference between two numbers by their average and then multiplying by 100. If I have 5 apples and you have 3 apples, there's a 50% difference in how many apples we have. 5 minus 3 is 2, and the average of 5 and 3 is 4. 2 divided by 4 is 0.5 times 100 is 50%. But how do we quantify change in a genome? Single point mutations are easy, you just count those up, but what about when an entire gene is duplicated? Do we count each individual nucleotide as one difference, or do we count the whole thing as one difference? What about an insertion? Again, we have a question of whether to count each nucleotide as a difference or count the whole insertion as a single difference, but then we have the added difficulty of how to count the bits that got split up. Do we say that they're the same because none of the nucleotides changed, or is it different because the overall sequence is now different? And I could go on. There is no one single way to calculate the percentage difference between two genomes, so when different researchers perform the calculation, they will get different results depending on how they quantify the differences.
And if all the presently known differences were counted and combined, the 600 million differences between human and chimp DNA drops the similarity down to only 80%.
Which is still pretty damn massive, considering your position is that we aren't related to chimps in the first place. And then when you consider things like endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs, and pseudogenes, it becomes quite clear that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. ERVs are caused by retroviruses inserting their genetic material into a cell's genome. If it happens to infect the germline, the virus will then become part of that organism's descendant's genome. Pseudogenes are copies of existing genes that have mutated to a point where they are no longer able to code for proteins. So when looking at human and chimp genomes, we find that there are a number of ERVs and pseudogenes in the same locations. For instance, the nanog genes. The functional nanog gene produces a transcription factor that allows embryonic stem cells to remain pluripotent during development, meaning that the embryonic stem cells retain their ability to turn into any kind of cell in the body. But in addition to the functional gene, we have 11 other copies scattered throughout our genome that are broken. 10 of the 11 copies can also be found in the chimp genome. They're just missing the one on human chromosome 15. The majority of these pseudogenes are not expressed and have no function, and the ones that are expressed debatably also have no function. Us having these genes in the same places does not make sense unless we share a common ancestor. Same goes for ERVs. They make up roughly 5% of the human genome, and the vast majority of them do not have any function whatsoever. Some do have an impact on the expression of nearby genes, so they can serve a regulatory function, but most do not, and are located in areas of the genome that are selectively neutral. That is, there are no selection pressures on those regions whatsoever. Changes will neither be eliminated through purifying selection, nor fixed in the genome through positive selection. Any that stick around long enough to get fixed are done so through pure random chance. The only reason a non-functional ERV would be shared between humans and chimps is because of common ancestry. Also, when a virus inserts its genetic material into a genome, it does so randomly. Because of the size of the genome, the random nature of the insertion, and the low probability that an insertion would not only happen in the germline, but subsequently become fixed in a population, it is essentially impossible for the same retrovirus to show up in the same location on the genome of two species, unless those two species share a common ancestor that was the source of the infection. So just one shared ERV between humans and chimps would be enough to conclusively prove common ancestry. But there are thousands of them, and not just in chimps. They are so abundant in all vertebrates that they can be used to construct phylogenies, family trees showing relatedness. And the phylogenies constructed using ERVs match up closely with the broader phylogenies constructed using other methods, showing that we are not just related to chimps, but we are also related to all the other vertebrates, with some being closer relations than others.
Okay, we finally land in the 2000s to find what was declared as one of the most convincing evidences of evolution.
Declared by whom? Creationists like to do this when presenting the evolutionary side of things. They pretend like whatever they're talking about is the most important thing ever, so that when they successfully cast doubt on it, they can act as though they've taken out a massive piece of the puzzle. When, in reality, it's usually just an example that is easy to understand, so frequently is used in educational settings. And here's the thing about that. If it's simple enough to use in an educational setting among high school students who are not on a path to specializing in evolutionary biology, it's inevitably going to be oversimplified. Creationists then point to the fact that it's oversimplified and declare victory, because we all know that more complicated things just can't be true.
And what was this marvelous discovery? The famous fishapod called Tiktaalik, a supposed transitional fish to tetrapod that was declared positive proof that fish had evolved into amphibians millions of years ago.
Yeah, but it's not just that it's a fish with fins that could be used for terrestrial locomotion. After all, there are fish alive today that do that, like mudskippers and Bashir. It was that, based on what we knew of evolution at the time, researchers predicted in a 1997 paper that an organism with the limb structure that Tiktaalik had would have developed in the Devonian period. So researchers went to Ellesmere Island in northern Canada because there is easy access to Devonian layers there, and began searching. And after several years, they found Tiktaalik, exactly what was predicted to exist in exactly the rock layers it was predicted to exist in, based on the assumption that evolution is true. So the reason Tiktaalik is so remarkable is more about the fact that researchers were able to say in advance not only that it would be found, but also where it would be found. And that is why evolution is science, while creationism can't even maintain a veneer of science. Using evolution, researchers can make accurate predictions about things they should be able to find. Creationists try to copy this by making post hoc predictions, like they'll say that the similarity between human and chimp DNA is due to a common designer rather than a common ancestor, and claim that that was a prediction. But there were no creationist scientists working before the two genomes were compared who predicted that they would be similar. They didn't start saying that until after it was abundantly clear that they were unambiguously very similar. But of course, I wouldn't expect anyone that thinks it's impressive that the Gospels record Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecies to understand why predictions are more impressive when made in advance of the things that they are predicting rather than after the fact. I guess post-diction just doesn't have the same ring to it.
But not long after, some fossil footprints were found of a creature that preceded the existence of Tiktaalik. by millions of years according to the evolutionary timescale.
Yep. Want to take a stab at what period the rock layers that they were found in are from? If you said Devonian, congratulations! Sure, these tracks are from slightly earlier than expected, but it's not far enough off to call the prediction into question. It just means that the most photogenic example wasn't actually the first. But not being the first doesn't mean that it wasn't an important discovery.
Obviously, like the Archaeopteryx example, if there were already fully formed tetrapods walking around 10 million years before Tiktaalik came on the scene, then the famous fishapod was neither the missing link nor proof of the story of evolution.
That is such a stupid argument. Like, sure, it wasn't the very first tetrapod ever. That doesn't mean it isn't representative of the transition between aquatic and terrestrial, though. Did you expect that the entire transition happened within a single species? That's not how transitions work. It's a gradual process happening slowly, in this case over millions of years. So why would finding another example of a transitional species within the time frame in which the transition was expected to occur negate the first species we discovered? Quite the opposite, it bolsters the argument. Now we have multiple examples of that transition that would most definitely have involved multiple species. Also, there's no reason to expect that the first example of a type of organism that we find is necessarily the first type of that organism to ever have existed, because that's not how finding things works.
Now, I could obviously go on, but I have to stop somewhere.
Yeah, you could obviously go on, but you have to stop somewhere. So, in this video that explicitly claims to be addressing not just the latest, but all of the evidence for evolution, you stop at a piece of evidence that is 2 decades old? Creationists really don't have any new arguments.
And I understand that no matter how many or precisely which of the supposed examples of evolutionary evidence I list, I know someone out there is going to howl in protest that I didn't deal with the exact evidence they feel is the real deal. The silver bullet that proves evolution beyond a doubt.
Hi, hello, that's me, I'm the one you talked about here. I mean, I'm mostly howling at the fact that you claim in the title of the video to be dealing with the latest evidence, but haven't even touched anything from the past 20 years, rather than the evidence that I'm aware of that you didn't bring up, though there was some of that in here too. But again, the fact that y'all are titling your video as though you are addressing an exhaustive list of all the latest evidence for evolution, and then saying in the video that there's a bunch of stuff that you don't even touch on, just shows that you guys are willing to lie for clicks. Which brings us full circle back to the fact that they have an article saying that it is never okay to lie, not even to save a Jew from a Nazi. So lying to save a life is wrong, but lying for clicks is acceptable for you? Really shows where their priorities are.
But I want to point out something. All of the particular evidences I just went through were once presented as exactly that. Undeniable proof that the story of evolution is credible, reliable, and scientific.
And the vast majority of the shit that you covered, both in this video and the last, still serve that purpose today. Sure, there were a couple of hoaxes that worked their way in there, and 1 or 2 things that we didn't understand at the time, and so it turned out to be a little bit different than we thought, but most of what you've covered could be summarized as, we learned that a thing was more complicated than we originally thought. In my humble opinion, learning is a good thing. If our knowledge remained static, we'd still be stuck in the Stone Age or worse.
In fact, I chose to cover some of the most iconic, powerful, and influential of them all.
And in going for iconic and influential, you wound up with stuff that is usually used as examples in high school biology because of their simplicity, not the actual strongest evidence.
And where are they now? Thrown out by the very people that still cling to the story of evolution.
Nope. Thrown out by you and your bizarre book-defacing propaganda piece, but mostly still perfectly valid examples of various aspects of evolution. I say mostly because I'm including the last video here where he talked about things like Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man, which, yes, were hoaxes, but also those were the only 2 things on his list of 13 that were actually hoaxes. The only other thing that might be said to no longer be useful is the crab thing. So pretty much everything else he said is no longer used as proof of evolution is still used as proof of evolution, we just have a more nuanced picture than we did in the past.
Based on evidence that will eventually drop off just like the others have.
Well, if they drop off just like the others have, then evolution will stand the test of time, because 10 out of 13 of the pieces of evidence that Calvin responded to are all still excellent evidence for evolution.
And hence, many bark their protests. How could anyone deny the overwhelming facts of evolution? I'll show you the proof, it's undeniable. However, Like confronting a bully that stands in front of you shouting what he intends to do to you? My response is, you and what army?
The army of actual evidence for evolution. Just watch my 2 responses to this video together. Actually, I might combine them into one video in the future, and see how many lies Calvin had to tell in order to make the evidence he presented seem like it had been debunked. And I'm not just talking about the disconnect between the titles and the content of the video, I'm talking about the flat-out false statements that Calvin had to make in order to support his position. The faulty premises he had to start with, the context he had to ignore. When your position relies on that sort of shaky reasoning, your position isn't tenable. So, Calvin, you claim to be debunking evolution, okay? You and what army?
Where's this supposed army of facts to make me kowtow to this unobservable evolutionary story?
In the scientific journals that you yourself quoted from. If you read the rest of the papers that those quotes came from, you'll find heaps of evidence without even leaving your own sources. But if you do choose to leave the very carefully curated selection of papers that have quotes that might look friendly to creationists when taken out of context, you'll find mountains of evidence.
This fairy tale for grown-ups that's supposed to make me disbelieve the authority of the Word of God?
Scanning for irony.
The bluey.
Oh shit, god damn it, Calvin, you blew up my irony detector.
The revelation of the one who knows all things because he created all things? Because it seems as though all we see is a field of fallen disposable heroes that did their duty for a time and were then cast into the trash heap after they were no longer useful.
And in another example of Calvin getting it perfectly backwards, that's exactly how the God or gods did it explanations for natural phenomena have gone over the years. But now that he's done ripping pages out of that book and throwing it in the garbage, do you suppose they're going to burn it? I feel like that's a thing they do. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Matthew J. Francis, who says, "I pray you realize it's your intellectual pride that blinds you from the truth of the gospel." Man, doesn't that just say the quiet part out loud? Gotta stop being so intellectual in order to believe Christianity. Sorry, but if I need to sacrifice my intellect to follow your religion, then I don't consider your religion to be one that is worth following. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the lies that are told by the apologist that is my channel. If you'd like to be a lying liar who lies, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Like, if instead of this witch cat... It's not a witch cat. One of my kids broke the witch cat, so I have to use the vampire cat.
I do not say meow meow meow.
Isn't RNA made of amino acids? No. No. It's nucleotides. Okay. See? I don't know shit sometimes too. But I bother to learn shit. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, fucking motorcycle guy. Fuck.